welcome to the True d'Etat segment where we go over political overthrows in America's history. Today we'll be talking about the overthrow of Mohammad Mossadeq in Iran, 1953. So it's interesting, in the Britannica Encyclopedia, it talks about the country's difficulties led to the ascent in 1925. It has a long history of different rulers and influences, the Shiite clergy, but it says the widespread dissatisfaction and the dynasty's subsequent overthrow led to the revolution in 1979, brought a regime to power that's uniquely combined with parliamentary democracy and Islamic theocracy. But what it didn't talk about was this guy, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., son of Theodore. The grandson of Theodore was a career intelligence officer who served in the Office of Strategic Services, forerunner to CIA, during and following the Second World War, went on to found Arabist organizations such as the American Friends of the Middle East, and played a lead role in the CIA-sponsored overthrow of Mohammad Mossadeq. Countless published accounts, including Kermit Roosevelt's detailed memoir, subsequent leak to the New York Times, and the 200-page CIA narrative history, intelligence agencies typically refused to budge, insisted on making a distinction between publicly available information on U.S. activities from non-government sources and official acknowledgement of those activities. The CIA confirms the role in the 1953 Iran coup, and that came 60 years later when it was released. Briefing book number 435, marking the 60th anniversary of the overthrow of the Iranian Prime Minister. The National Security Archive today is posting recently declassified documents on the United States' role in the controversial operation. American and British involvement in Mossadeq's ouster has long been public knowledge, but today's posting includes what is believed to be the CIA's first formal acknowledgement that the agency helped to plan and execute the coup. The explicit reference to the CIA's role in an internal history, the battle for Iran, dated from the mid-1970s. The agency released a heavily excised version of the account in 1981 in response to an ACLU lawsuit, but it blacked out all references to TPAJAX, the code name for the US-led operation. Additional CIA materials include working files from Kermit Roosevelt, the senior CIA officer. Fundamental questions hatch the plot: who carried it out, who supported Iran, and how did it succeed, are in dispute. So here it shows armed forces converged on his house around 4 p.m. That's Mossadeq, and they surrounded him and basically overthrew and installed the Shah. In October 1910, Britain delivered an ultimatum to Iran concerning the security of southern Iran. In doing so, Britain set an example for the Russians to follow. Russian troops had already occupied the northern provinces. In November 1911, the Tsarist government presented its own ultimatum to Iran, which amounted to nothing less than an attempt to reduce the north of the country to the status of a semi-dependent colony. Iran hoped to avoid entanglement in World War I by declaring its neutrality, but ended up as a battleground for Russian, Turkish, and British troops. When German agents tried to arouse the southern tribes against the British, Britain created an armed force, the South Persia Rifles, to protect its interests. So this has been going on way longer than we suspect or we even know about. So for decades, they've been facing threats and division and just political overthrow. This is a great website, iranreview.org. I'll leave this in the description as well. Mohammad Mossadeq was a beloved figure in Iran. During his tenure, he introduced a range of social and economic policies, the most significant being the nationalization of the Iranian oil industry. Great Britain had controlled Iran's oil for decades through the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. After months of talks, the Prime Minister broke off negotiations and denied the British any further involvement in Iran's oil industry. Britain then appealed to the United States for help, which eventually led to the CIA to orchestrate the overthrow of Mossadeq and restore power to Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the last Shah of Iran. So, when another country decides it's going to take its own resources, nationalize the system, and then give that money and power back to its own people, that just doesn't sit well with America. Roosevelt quickly seized control of the Iranian press by buying them off with bribes and circulating anti-Mossadegh propaganda, recruited allies among Islamic clergy, and convinced the Shah that Mossadegh was a threat. The last step entailed a dramatic attempt to apprehend Mossadegh at his house in the middle of the night, but the coup failed. Mossadegh learned of it and fought back. The next morning, he announced the victory over the radio. Mossadegh thought he was in the clear, but Roosevelt hadn't given up. He orchestrated a second coup, which succeeded. Mossadegh was placed on trial and spent his life under house arrest. The Shah returned to power and ruled for another 25 years until the 1979 Iranian Revolution. The coup was later invoked by students and the political class in Iran as a justification for overthrowing the Shah. The reason we did this was to have a leader that would bend to our demands and not ask questions. And we are, again, in another sanctioning and potential overthrow of Iran. Let's check out Kermit Roosevelt. He's got a great document that I'll leave in the description about the Palestinian territory. This is the NPR's story on it. Overthrew it in 4 days. There's some great articles on this. Britain delivered an ultimatum to Iran regarding the security. So the Russians and the Britons were all over Iran in the early 1900s, late 1800s for the oil. And there's a lot more than meets the eye, because 1951 and 1915 and 1921 was the First World War around that same time, and the Anglo-Persian Agreement of 1919 was widely viewed as establishing a British protectorate over Iran. However, it aroused considerable opposition, and the Majlis refused to approve it. The agreement was already dead when, in February 1921, the Persian Cossacks Brigade officer Reza Khan, in collaboration with prominent journalist Saeed Zia ad-Din Tabai, marched into Tehran and seized power, inaugurating a new phase in Iran's modern history. So this was all during what was called the Ottoman Empire, and that's what's pretty interesting, because the fall of the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy, the Ottoman and Russian empires, followed by the USSR and Kemalist Republic in Turkey, were among the most significant outcomes of the conflict. So Western Europe, Eastern Europe, the Persian Empire, and the Gulf states were all heavily affected by World War I. And so that's where it gets interesting, and where there's not a lot talked about. But the Ottoman Empire was a pretty strong empire, and the dismantling of it, creating new city-states that can be overthrown and controlled by puppets, was the plan from the beginning. In Persia first arises that light which shines itself and illuminates what is around. The principle of development begins with the history of Persia. This constitutes, therefore, the beginning of history. George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. So I'll leave these links in the description. Look it over for yourself and dive deep, because once you get into the history of the late 1800s, the 1700s, and even farther back, all the way, you could go all the way back to, Babylon. Um, and I've heard a lot of things about the Tartarians, um, those type of, theories. And I think it's pretty interesting because when you look at pictures of the rulers of Egypt and the Ottoman Empire, they kind of got that Tartarian thing going on. Muhammad Ali, Ishmael the Magnificent, they've all kind of got this kind of, European Tartarian thing going on. So let me know what you guys think, and I'm gonna try to dig up some more on this in the meantime. This has been the segment True D'Etat by the Propaganda Republic.